Today I wanted to talk to you about the 10 commandments of visiting the Netherlands. These are 10 thou shalt nots, 10 things not to do when you're here. And don't get me wrong, there are so many wonderful things to do when you're visiting this country. So many places to see, so many activities to get engaged with, and so many wonderful sights. But this is just a list of things that you really should not do while you're here. And it's intended to make your visit a little bit more seamless and less disruptive for the Dutch. Number 1, don't assume that everyone can or wants to speak English. Although most people in the Netherlands speak English at a very high level, they don't necessarily feel like speaking English. It's not their first language. Their first language is obviously Dutch, and you would go a long way to just learn a couple of phrases of Dutch when visiting. Please and thank you, good morning, whatnot. And something also relating to that I kind of had to modify along the way is I had a tendency to approach Dutch people and ask them if they speak English. Do you speak English? And yeah, 9 times out of 10, they do. So I don't know. I felt like that wasn't really the best way to go about it. So I modified that early on, and I would start by saying, may I continue in English? I don't know. That's just my thing. But don't assume that everyone can or wants to speak English. Number 2 is don't call the country Holland. And I know this is tricky sometimes for many Americans because frankly, I think if you asked many Americans where the Netherlands is, they would kind of look at you quizzically because I'm not sure they've heard of it for the most part. We do tend to regard the country as Holland. But the Netherlands is made up of 12 provinces, and only 2 of those provinces are actually called Holland, North Holland and South Holland. And indeed, there's a great concentration of people in those particular provinces because they contain the cities of Amsterdam and Haarlem, where I live, and Leiden and others. So you could be forgiven, I think, for assuming that the country is called Holland. And also, I know for many Americans, it's an easy mistake to make because we have towns in the U.S. In various states called Holland. There's Holland, Michigan, which, by the way, there are many Dutch settlers that have settled in Holland, Michigan, and have lived there for many generations. I visited there for a school trip one time, and there's a festival called Tulip Time in Holland, Michigan, and there are windmills there and cheese, and so it really does celebrate everything Dutch. There's also a Holland, Pennsylvania. I lived for several years in the city of Philadelphia, and Holland, Pennsylvania is not that far outside of Philadelphia. And in fact, one time I was eating in a diner, one of the classic American diners, 24/7, called Melrose Diner in Philadelphia. By the way, if you're ever in Philadelphia, I recommend it. It's an amazing place, and there are career waitresses there on their tags. It indicates when they started, and I remember back in the day when I was going to that diner, there were waitresses there with tags dating back to 1972, if you can imagine, and some of the relative newcomers were from the 80s. But one time when I was at that diner in a booth, and they have a booth construction which is kind of shared so that on one half of the booth you may be there with your friends, and on the other half of the booth are strangers. And I was sitting on one half of this booth with a friend of mine, and on the opposite side, directly across from me, were a couple of older women. And we struck up a conversation, and I mentioned the fact that I was living, and I probably mistakenly said, well, no, in fact, I think I said the Netherlands, and they didn't know what I meant. So I said Holland, and they said, oh, yes, I have a brother who lives in Holland. And in the course of the conversation, I realized that they were talking about Holland, Pennsylvania, which is just a few miles outside of Philadelphia. So I had to correct them. And it's also kind of funny because they asked me about the language in the Netherlands, and I was just learning at the time. And so they asked me to say something in Dutch. And I thought for a moment, and they then just said, well, say good morning. And I said, goedemorgen. And they said, oh, I see. So it's like English with an accent. One wishes. But back to what I was saying, don't refer to the whole country itself as Holland. Be more informed and show off your geography skills and refer to it correctly as the Netherlands. If you want to be really fancy, you can call it the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but that's entirely unnecessary. Number 3 on my list is considered a cardinal sin, and that is walking in the bike lane. So really make every effort to stay on the sidewalk and don't stand or walk in the bike lane. And I know it's very tempting because the bike lanes sometimes can be quiet, and if the sidewalk is crowded with pedestrians, it's tempting to sort of, breeze along in this relatively open space, but then you'll be unpleasantly surprised by a sharp ting on the bike, if you're lucky, if you're not just struck by a cyclist. So definitely, that's one way to really upset a Dutch person. And the Dutch are very mild by nature, but boy, if you're going to trigger them, that's one way to do it, and that's to stand and loiter in the bike lane. So don't do it, people. Don't do it. Number 4 on my list of don'ts is don't confuse coffee shops with cafes. It can be tempting for an unassuming tourist to step into a coffee shop expecting a nice brew of cappuccino, and it's possible to get coffee in a coffee shop, it's true. But coffee shops in the Netherlands are places where one buys cannabis and can smoke. So if that's your interest, well, then a coffee shop is for you. But if you really are just interested in having a great cup of coffee, well, then you want to stick to a cafe. And by the way, there are so many wonderful cafes in this country. In the city that I live in, Haarlem, there are several. I mean, there must be a dozen. And yeah, you have a Starbucks out by the train station, but really, don't go to the Starbucks. You're here in the Netherlands. Take advantage of one of the many privately owned cafes. They're all unique. They all have a wonderful atmosphere and delicious coffee. You can even do a cafe tour while you're here and go to different cafes and sit outside on the terrace and watch the world go by while you're sipping your cappuccino or your cafe latte. 5 on my list of don'ts is don't assume that you can use your credit card everywhere. Don't rely on your credit card, especially in grocery stores. I have a friend who frequently visits from London, and so many times he's with me and wants to pick up a few groceries at the local grocery store, and he takes out that credit card and swipes it, and well, it's declined. The only way that you really can pay in a grocery store is with a PIN pass or your mobile phone connected to your bank account directly, or with cash, even though that's becoming more rare. So don't rely on the credit card. It's not going to be accepted everywhere like it might be in the United States or wherever you're from. Number 6 on my list of don'ts is don't show up at a Dutch person's house unannounced. That is definitely not the norm. They like to schedule things, and I've made reference to it in terms of a stereotype that's often associated with the Dutch, which is true, is that they are agenda-driven, so they tend to like to record appointments and dates in an agenda. So it's not really welcomed if you're going to just show up at their door unannounced. And as an additional tip, when you have made an appointment with a Dutch person to get together at their home, make sure to bring something. Bring a bottle of wine or some fresh flowers. Don't come empty-handed. That's always appreciated if you just bring a little something along with you as a gesture. Number 7 on my list is don't beat around the bush. I've had lengthy conversations and talked about this in previous videos, the tendency of Americans in particular and the British and people from perhaps other cultures to kind of beat around the bush and skirt around a conversation and not be so direct and not be transparent and not be truthful. And that's not appreciated here. The Dutch are famously direct. I prefer to call it honest. The Dutch like to tell it like it is, and they won't be afraid to do that. So you should do the same. Speak your truth. Don't beat around the bush. Just tell a Dutch person what you like and what you don't like and what you're prepared to do and what you're not. They will respect that level of honesty. So please, don't beat around the bush. Number 8 on my list of don'ts is don't go crashing into a train as soon as it arrives on the platform. Please take a moment to step aside and allow the passengers that are in the train to deboard, to get off the train first. It's the right thing to do, people. So don't go bustling into the train before the people who are leaving the train have had an opportunity to get off. So that's another don't for you. Number 9 on my list of don'ts is relating to the trains. There are silent cars in the trains marked with the word stilte, which means silence. And you should be silent when you're in those cars. You'll see a little sticker along the top of each window indicating that it is a silent car. So please respect that. I don't know if you knew, but by the way, that's an idea that was introduced by the loud Americans of all people. It was Amtrak that first introduced the concept of a silent cabin, and that was back in 2001. And the Dutch began to roll that out here in 2003. And it's a great concept if you're just tired or you just want to kind of sit in silence and peace. What a great concept, you know, to be able to go to a specific car on the train and just relax and hear your own thoughts. So it's not really very polite if you're having a conversation in spite of those clearly demarcated cabins, or talking, God forbid, on your telephone, or even listening to music that sort of leaks out of a pair of headphones. So really be more mindful of that. Number 10 on my list of thou shalt nots, and it's another do not do when you're here in the Netherlands. Don't assume that Amsterdam is the Netherlands. It is not. In fact, it's probably the most un-Dutch of cities, and you know, again, I don't want to be so black and white and speak in generalizations, because of course there are many Dutch people that do live in Amsterdam, both in the outskirts and in the inner city. But when you are walking around kind of tourist central of Amsterdam, really it's not particularly Dutch. It caters exclusively to the tourist market, and so you'll get kind of a false sense of what it is to be here in the Netherlands. So I strongly encourage you, when you're visiting Amsterdam, to venture outside of the city. There are so many other wonderful cities and sights to see, such as Haarlem, which is only a 15-minute train ride away, and which, in my opinion, is a far more authentic Dutch city. And of course, there's the legendary countryside of the Netherlands, down in the south of the Netherlands, or up north in Friesland, which is so beautiful and well worth a visit. And there are even, say, the islands up off the coast in the north, such as Texel, which is, again, well worth a visit. So there's so much to see, and I'll save all of that for another video, because this video is focused more on the do nots, and that is my 10th do not. Well, I hope you enjoyed this little video about what not to do in the Netherlands. Again, I want to remind you that there are so many wonderful things to do, so if you have an opportunity to visit this lovely country, I highly recommend it. Obviously, I visited here 22 years ago and I never left, so clearly I fell in love with it, and I'm sure you will too. But just bear in mind some of the do nots that I've discussed. It'll make your visit more pleasant, and you won't disrupt the Dutch as much. So again, take care, thank you for watching, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.